Again, thank you all for being here. It is my pleasure to welcome two very distinguished guests. I flipped a coin on which one to introduce first, and Goody, you won. This is, to my far left is Thurgood Marshall Jr. You might recognize the name. To those of us who've known him for a while, he goes by Goody. So, but that's the just like Skip. You know, some of us get great nicknames. He worked in the Clinton White House. He served as assistant to the president and was the secretary to the cabinet. He's a lawyer. He specializes in public policy issues. He's on the board of the Ford Foundation and is the former chairman of the Board of Governors for the United States Post Office. And obviously has a great legacy and a great story. We welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning author Gilbert King, who is an extraordinary writer and tells a remarkable historical event, describes it in great detail with this story. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post. He's contributor on a regular basis to the Smithsonian History blog. You might not know this, but he is a self-taught photographer and he is an avid golfer. And his previous book, the author of The Execution of Willie Francis, about a 16-year-old in Louisiana. But this is the book that he won the Pulitzer for. Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, in the Dawn of a New America. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gilbert King and Thurgood Marshall Jr. First question to you.
All right.
Who were the Groveland Boys?
Well, the Groveland Boys, if you could think back to, I think many people are familiar with the Scottsboro Boys. So this is a case that happens 20 years later. Nobody knows about it. It's far more violent. Not just violent for the Groveland Boys themselves, because they were hunted down one by one and basically killed by a sheriff and his deputy. But it's also an interesting case because Thurgood Marshall was involved in this right at the time where he's just starting Brown versus Board. So think about that. Here you have one of the most important landmark cases in United States 20th century history, and you have Thurgood Marshall putting his life on the line at the same time, taking on this Scottsboro Boys type case. So that's basically who the Groveland Boys were back in Florida in 1949.
So, Goody, when did you learn about the Groveland Boys, and when did you learn about the significance of this particular case?
Well, the interesting thing in response to that question, Skip, is that I did not know very much at all about this case growing up. I did not hear about the case at home, although I know that my father, I've since learned that my father spoke about it quite a bit with a number of people. He was very much a storyteller and was certainly a storyteller for me and for my brother, particularly about his cases and the remarkable people with whom he worked and the people on the road who took care of them and protected them. I have found it, particularly after reading Gilbert's remarkable book, I've tried to give some thought as to why it is that I didn't hear much about the Groveland cases. And I haven't fully figured that out. I will come back on it, but I do think that there's an element of, it's almost a bit of an admission on his part that he was so immersed in his work at that time that if my brother and I had come along in that period, we would have been neglected. And I learned not only from that case through Gilbert's book, but through Gilbert's research into how my father was working on fundraising and building the organization at the time, because he very much was trying to build off of the press reports that were coming off of these cases whenever they would hit. That was the perfect time to try to help build financial resources for the organization. So he was not home very much at all. And if we had come along earlier in his life, and I think he realizes what would have happened. And indeed, he did acknowledge late in his life that he regarded it as his significant failing of all failings, that he essentially missed the fact that his first wife was as ill as she was because he was on the road so much.
Gilbert, when did you come across this story, and what prompted you to take it to this level?
Well, I came across this story while I was doing research for my last book, and I was just surprised to see Thurgood Marshall involved in consulting these other lawyers. And I thought, well, he's so far ahead of his time. He was saying, you're going to defend this young Willie Francis kid, but there's other things you could be doing. And he was reaching out to the media. He was reaching out to movie stars to create public awareness. He was working behind the scenes to meet with the clergy members to sort of influence them, because they were about to make this very powerful decision about whether to send a 16-year-old kid back to the electric chair after he'd survived the first try. And so Marshall's wanted to capitalize on how society would react to that. And so when I started digging into that, I was wondering, what else was Thurgood Marshall involved in if this was not even part of his really resume? And I think the reason that we don't know about cases like this, it's basically because of Thurgood Marshall's career. He was a Supreme Court justice, so there's a lot of books written about that. But he would have been famous if he had never been a Supreme Court justice. He was the architect of all these really imperative landmark civil rights cases, Smith versus Allwright, the voting rights cases, the housing cases, Brown versus Board. His contribution and his record before the Supreme Court in just really redefining the America that we live in today. And so his era as Mr. Civil Rights, the 30s and the late 40s, is kind of given a back seat because he accomplished so many other great things in his life. So I found that biographers weren't focusing on these criminal cases. They were really focusing on these landmark decisions and then focusing on what he was able to accomplish in the Supreme Court and the rise to the Supreme Court. And so there's a whole other career that Marshall had in the days where he was, he was the man, Mr. Civil Rights, out there fighting for justice in criminal cases. And think about that. What Supreme Court justices do we have now who've accomplished as much as an attorney?
Before we get into this Florida thing, Goody, I want to ask you a question about Arkansas and your dad in Arkansas. Clearly, I see my friend Phyllis Brown back there, the sister of Minnie Jean Brown Trickey, and your dad's role in that, the famous picture that on the steps at the Supreme Court with Daisy Bates and the Nine and your dad. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'd love to, and it is the reason why Little Rock is such a special place in Marshall family lore. Particularly, Skip, you mentioned Daisy Bates, who the joke among the lawyers was when the Bates family would put up the lawyers in their home, who would get stuck by the front window, because things would regularly get thrown through the window. And my father was always trying to be the last one in the room so he could switch bags and avoid the front window. In Gilbert's book, you will see why, if you've not yet read it, that was as much in jest as anything else, because the people of Little Rock got together, and anytime the lawyers came into town, the word went out that there was a quote, sick relative in need of people to sit up with them through the night. And what that meant was they needed some extra protection so the lawyers could actually sleep through the night and not have to worry about something coming through that window. But things came through that window not long after they left town, and it's always been a poignant reminder to us of how many important people played a role like that. And my father always spoke about that they'd come in, they'd work their cases, they'd leave, and these remarkable people would continue under great threat to themselves, their livelihoods, and their lives. And so Daisy Bates is at the top of that list of heroes. And those kids gathered there every morning to go to school. And that had to be a wonderful kind of a home base to count on for support.
So the sick relative thing, which again, which you highlight in your book about when he was in Florida and people protected him, I didn't realize that was happening in Little Rock as well. That must have been a very common occurrence for the civil rights lawyers, particularly the African American lawyers in the South. The interesting thing, Gilbert, about this book, I mean, there's so much interesting, and if you hadn't read this book, you all need to read this book, but one of the most interesting things and the most stunning thing to me, perhaps besides the awfulness of it all, was Florida. I mean, with the highest respect, you know, Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, but Florida?
Right. And I think that was, I talk about that in the book as Florida being south of the South. And in other words, it wasn't one of those cotton belt states that made the news. And so these atrocities that would show up in Louisiana and Mississippi and Georgia did make the papers. But some of the things that were happening down in Florida were even more horrific. Florida had a higher per capita lynching rate than any other state in the United States. And this was Florida. It was called, at the time, the most dangerous place to be black. And so, but all these cases sort of flowed underneath the radar. And I still get it today. I travel around Florida, and there's a man in the book who's one of Marshall's associates, the president of the NAACP in Florida. And in the middle of this case, the Klan puts a bomb under his house, killing both him and his wife. So he becomes a martyr to the civil rights movement, and yet there are memorials around that. His name's not even mentioned on there. And I think it's part the fact that it's Florida, and just part the fact that it happened earlier than Medgar Evers' death. And so people like Emmett Till, who became well known and his picture went around the nation, around the world, these atrocities, things like that were happening in Florida. And Thurgood Marshall was working on these cases, and nobody really knew about them.
So let's give a brief synopsis of the story, and I know my academic friends don't like this, but sort of the Cliff Notes version of, sorry professors, but sort of the Cliff Notes version, the theme of the story of sort of what happened.
Well, basically, it's very similar. I'm sure you've all read or at least seen To Kill a Mockingbird. This case really does echo that. So it's these 4 African Americans who are falsely accused of rape. And once those accusations are made, this story becomes in the hands of a very cruel sheriff and a racist prosecutor who just makes sure to railroad this case through. So Thurgood Marshall sends his LDF team to defend these kids in this trial, and it's just a travesty of justice. I mean, they just ramrod these kids right straight through to the electric chair. And so that's when Marshall and his LDF lawyers really take control of this, because they're used to losing these cases in the South where they can't control what the prosecutor does, can't control the jury. But they felt that the Supreme Court was a level playing field. And so Marshall and his lawyers take this case and appeal it to the Supreme Court and win it. And that's said. Now, what's interesting is Justice Robert Jackson comments on the case. It's overturned on the selection of the jury roles. But Justice Robert Jackson goes out of his way in his opinion to say, this case represents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. On those grounds, I would reverse. And so after this Supreme Court victory, the Groveland Boys have to go back to another trial. And the sheriff, who's made this implicit bargain with the people of Lake County, basically goes up to Rayford State Prison to get the Groveland Boys and to bring them back down on the eve of the trial. And he takes a side road down a clay road and basically opens fire and claims that it was an escape from prison. Now, one of them miraculously survived and goes on to tell the tale of just cold-blooded murder. He says, why would I escape? I have Thurgood Marshall as my lawyer. I just won in the Supreme Court. Why would I pick now to escape? And it turns out that the FBI examined the forensics, the bullets, and they found that indeed, this young man, Walter Irvin, was telling the truth, cold-blooded murder, and that was all covered up. And I think that was the most shocking thing about this entire case is that there's evidence of murder in the FBI files, and it's all been sealed for 60 years. So when I filed the Freedom of Information Act, I was the one that actually found these files and these bullets and these photographs and the FBI report saying the sheriff and the deputy should be indicted immediately. This is murder. And the U.S. attorney quashed it. And the 4 words that I think I found most disturbing to this day, they quashed it for reasons, quote, tranquility of the South. In other words, if people really knew what was happening, they would riot in the streets.
Okay, Goody. I mean, that's sort of the synopsis of the story, as ugly and as painful as it is. Today, we are faced with Baltimore. Today, we are faced with other issues, and I think, Gilbert, you can say that this location in Florida, how far was it from Trayvon Martin?
It was just a few miles really down the road from where Harry T. Moore lost his life.
Have things changed, Goody? Any better? Since your dad was out there fighting?
Well, fair question. Tough act to follow, by the way, right? Yeah. This is a remarkable story. There were so many landmark achievements, and not just the court cases, the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, fair housing, so many remarkable landmark achievements in the wake of these significant events, and so many remarkable moments in American history where people of every color and faith came together to do the right thing and reset the trajectory of the country. Yet there have been so many miscues since then. So a lot of accomplishment, achievement, remarkable landmark decisions and opportunities, but so much more that needs to be done, and unfortunately it plays out in very unfortunate and ugly ways. But I think there's no one single policy problem that speaks to this. It is a host of issues, whether it's economic opportunity or educational opportunities or fair housing or the whole portfolio of criminal justice issues and reforms that continue to need to be addressed. And I do find it disturbing that while so much progress has been made and so much more progress has yet to be made, that at the same time there are clearly a number of issues where things are regressing. And so it's a difficult time to watch these kinds of events occur, but I think if there is a benefit to it, it is that we as a country are having an excuse and an opportunity to raise these questions once again.
Gilbert, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, and I will go back to sort of looking at history to sort of because I do get asked that a lot about how have things changed, and it's hard to look at the Freddie Grays and the Trayvon Martins and the Michael Browns and these stories in the news, and it's very difficult to say, wow, these things are still happening. One of the things I think is that the amount of progress is kind of not easily defined unless you really go back and look now at the history. Now, in the time when Thurgood Marshall was taking these criminal cases with his lawyers down south in the late 40s and 50s, there was no such thing as protest. As soon as some people gathered on the corners, deputies and sheriffs would beat them and disperse them. So there's no protest. If you look back at the Trayvon Martin case, one of the big things that changed that was the amount of protests that happened on the streets. Now, whether or not you agree with the trial verdict, or at least there was a trial, at least those were tested in court. Back in the 40s and 50s, many of these cases never got to court. They would end in lynchings. They would just be horrible outcomes. So there has been a tremendous amount of progress. Getting back to the history, I think it's important. Understanding is a major thing that I think I learned through the research that I've done. When I go back and look at these cases, I look at a lot of coroner's reports. I go to some pretty dark places in the files that I look through. And, you know, we see that there are lynching statistics in the South, but what we don't really see are the actual missing persons and the murders that take place. So one particular case that really just, and I'll just describe it briefly, was a deputy in a Louisiana town who had gotten word that his daughter was stepping out, quote, with an African-American young man. And so he showed up at the house of this young man, knocked on the door, the father brought the kid down, and they walked out into the darkness. And 60 yards into the darkness, there's a shot fired. And it becomes the word of this deputy in this coroner's report, made up of local people in this town, that said, he went for my gun. I was just taking him in for questioning, and he went for my gun. And so these stories get passed down from generation to generation in families. They're not always covered in the newspaper, but they're part of a family's lore. And so when something like this happens and you see somebody get shot on the streets today, and you know, it becomes the policeman's word. He'll say things like, I feared for my life. And those kind of words have been, you know, stuck in the craw of people for decades. And so I think that's why you see the kind of reaction that you do, because this is part of the tradition, the missing persons and the you know, justifiable homicides that show up in these coroner reports.
So talk about, you identified him briefly, talk about the sheriff in this role and what you learned about him.
Well, I think one of the things that it's hard to imagine today, that a sheriff could have so much power in some of these towns, but back then they were the most powerful person in anyone's life in these towns. And a lot of it had to do with the laws that were on the books, the legalized white supremacy. One of the laws that was in place in Florida and many southern states was the worker fight laws. They began in World War I, but they stayed on the books, and sometimes they were ratified later on, well after World War II. So in 1949 in Florida, a sheriff had the right to drive through a community and find a young man. It was usually African Americans that they did this to. And they said, are you in the military? No. Are you working today? No. Get in the car, you're going to jail. So if you were not in the military and you were not working that day, the sheriff had the right to arrest you. And it was called the bail bond racket. And what they do is they'd round up a dozen men, throw them in jail, then they'd call up the local citrus farmers and grove owners and say, I got 12 bodies. And they would get fined $50, and they'd have to work off the $50 in the field or in the groves. And remarkably, the law is written this way in Florida. The sheriff got to keep the fines. So he was totally incentivized to do this. And so you could imagine that thumb of oppression that would leak into a household if you took the breadwinner in that family on a Saturday when he wasn't working and threw him in jail for 2 weeks. So that's the kind of fear that a sheriff could impose. And you know, I mentioned this in an earlier interview, you know, talk about the role of the sheriffs. You know, Bull Connor is one that comes to mind as sort of this caricature. And Sheriff Willis McCall made Bull Connor look like Barney Fife. And you know, Bull Connor was known for the fire hoses and the dogs. Sheriff McCall was murdering people. And so that was a reality in the South.
What did he brag about? What was the story you were telling me that he bragged about?
Oh, he had a couple famous quotes, and these are, you know, although, you know, these are in his autobiography, so he wasn't misquoted. He said, I never killed someone who didn't deserve killing. That was one of his comments. He had a couple awful quotes along the way. I put a few of them in the book, but some of them became so distasteful I didn't want to give him the credit of it.
What did you read, civil rights?
Oh, right. He had, yeah, one of the things he was very proud of. He'd been brought up on civil rights charges 43 times, and he beat them all. Yeah.
Well, he was quite. Who were besides Thurgood Marshall in this story? Who were the heroes? Who were the ones that I mean, weren't there some people that saw the light at some point?
I think that was a great testament to the influence of Thurgood Marshall, and that's a big part of what happens in this book. So we have this racist prosecutor who just does every example of prosecutorial misconduct. On the second trial, at the end, he thinks it might be close because now he's going up against the great Thurgood Marshall in court. So he leans on that jury rail and he tells the jurors, I hate to tell you this, but I have been stricken with a fatal disease, and I do not want to go out with a loss on my record. And he basically implores the jury give him this one last break. At this time, Marshall and his lawyers aren't even objecting. There's so many of these things. But he did see the light, and later on in an interview, he attributed that to being in the presence of Thurgood Marshall. He considered Marshall the greatest lawyer he'd ever seen. And think about this. This was an old Southern, racist, bigoted lawyer, and he had a change of heart, and he goes on to make a pivotal decision at the end of this case, and it was based on the influence of Thurgood Marshall on his own life. And you saw it within a reporter who starts out as a racist, and she becomes to be acquainted with Thurgood Marshall, and she starts to see things differently, and she later became a very famous civil rights reporter. So it was sort of these changes of heart that were capable. I think one of the things that's most impressive is Marshall knew that he was going to lose a lot of these criminal cases. He wasn't going to win locally with these juries. But he said it was just as important for the people, the African Americans in that Jim Crow balcony, to take a look at him arguing a case in a courtroom, because it gave them hope for what was possible for the future. And so those cases were just as important for Marshall. And later on he said these criminal cases are important because they save lives.
Goody, as you travel all over the country, I bet you get Thurgood Marshall stories everywhere you go. But I just want to say that, his leadership, and this story really showed me a whole new side of him. I mean, I knew about Brown v. Board, and I knew about Central High School, but in the courtroom in a criminal case, getting on a train, going to Florida, death threat after death threat. Did he ever, he didn't necessarily talk about this case, but did he ever talk to you and your family about how hard it was and how high the mountains were?
Never. For himself.
Yeah, for himself.
Always spoke with remarkable respect and often with great humor as well about the people he encountered on these cases. Deep respect for his clients and the people that were the local organizers and supporters. I mentioned this earlier, but the other thing about this is that he, if you look at a number of these cases, many of the individuals who prevailed in their cases ended up leaving their communities and moving north. And it's because they just paid such a price that they couldn't continue to reside where they had been living for generations. And that weighed on him heavily, and he kept track of these people. As I learned from Gilbert's book, he was on the court. He mentioned when he was on the court, as a couple of other justices have as well, that as much of an honor and challenge as that job can be, most of them preferred being combatants and lawyers rather than referees. And these cases stuck with him, and as I learned from Gilbert's book, he was looking for FBI files even when he was sitting at the court on this case. So he carried this with him.
All right, your turn. You have a chance to quiz a pretty famous American and a pretty well-known Pulitzer Prize-winning author about civil rights. Yes, in the back. No, Goody, you're the well-known American. Yes, Rebecca, at the back, please. Yeah, wait for the microphone.
It's a pleasure to see both of you. It's an honor. I came from Memphis. It's not that far away, but I did.
Wow.
So I could come see you.
That's
Are you
impressive.
coming to Memphis by any chance?
No, I'm not from there, but I've been there. I love it.
Are you coming to speak in Memphis?
Not yet. I don't have anything scheduled, but I would love to someday.
So we can find out how to contact you so we can
Yeah,
make that
well,
happen.
let's
Okay.
talk after this.
Great. The lynching thing, I know that's not the point of the book. The book is great. I've got the Kindle version, but I couldn't figure out a way for you to sign that one, so I got another one. But the questions both of you could just touch lightly on lynching, and I'm just wondering, since the NAACP was largely founded to combat lynching, actually, and obviously the picture of the flag of the man was lynched today or yesterday,
Right.
hanging from the office in New York, and also your father almost being lynched in Tennessee with Alexander Luby and all of that. I'm just wondering if, even though education, teacher pay disparity, all those other things were highlighted, well, I just wonder if your father ever talked about lynching, his fight against lynching, the Senate not ever passing anti-lynching legislation, things like that.
Not with me or my brother, no.
And just to follow up, I think that was a very common thing. I find that when I did a lot of research, a lot of the families who experienced these atrocities, their children knew nothing about them. They were just so shameful and so painful that they didn't want to share them with another generation. And I find that a lot, that people contact me, say, my family was involved in this case. It was a Supreme Court case. It happened in my backyard. I knew nothing of it. So I don't think that's uncommon.
Phyllis Brown can attest to that, because when we did the 40th anniversary of the Central High desegregation, many of the families of the Little Rock Nine did not know all the details of that, and some of the nine would say that they never discussed it with their families. So, Phyllis, you got the floor.
We have many pictures of your father with the Little Rock Nine, and even though I am the tag-along sister, I would have loved to have been in those pictures. So, welcome to Little Rock. Will you please take a photo with me so I can send it to her? Then I can say to my sister and the other nine. And so, talk about Ogletree and Charles Houston, and they were very much a part of that. However, my question is, didn't the Supreme Court betray us in 2013? They betrayed all of your father's work. They betrayed all of the work of the people of the modern day civil rights movement. The Supreme Court betrayed us. So whether you agree with me or not, it really doesn't matter. I believe that. They did betray us. Now, you answer.
By the way, Phyllis is not opinionated in any form. Y'all want to comment on that?
Well,
You don't have to. Phyllis is fact.
I can't disagree, but we're heading into an election season, and the balance on the court is very delicate, and the number of unfilled federal judgeships in the district and circuit courts is appalling too, and all of those nominations matter, especially at the Supreme Court. So people like to mention that at some point during the campaign, but it never seems to be mentioned enough.
Yes, ma'am, we have a question right up here.
You said that there were very few protests in the early days. Possibly it was because there was so little that other people knew except through newspapers and media. What do you think the role of social media is now playing in the difference where we're having a lot of the riots?
Good for you for asking a social media question. I'm very impressed with that. It's actually tremendous right now. I mean, you can see it as you follow these events now, especially look at cell phone cameras, how that changes things. I mean, there's some of these stories, you know, the case in Charleston that you saw, you know, that story, if you follow the history of it, a story like that might never make the newspapers because it would just be like, yep, he ran. We have proof that he ran, and you know, he went for my taser, he went for, you know, this, and then now all of a sudden you got this cell phone. That is really important. What's remarkable about in the history of I'll just go back to this one particular case. Life magazine sent a photographer down and kind of documented this investigation in real time. And there's a photograph in this particular book, which usually you don't have any photographs of any of these crimes back then. There's a photograph in this book where Willis McCall summons his friends back to the scene, and he tries to set up a stage where he can put his rumpled hat on the hood of the car, and his clothes are all ripped, and he's standing there kind of forlorn, and that became the image of the poor sheriff who, look, they grabbed his clothes, they rumpled his hat, he's got a little bit of blood, and that photograph was all about a lie. And that's just not something you get in the early 1950s. But what's remarkable about that is that Walter Irvin survived, and he told a very different tale. He could see, as he's laying there pretending to be dead, the sheriff ripping his clothes, getting on the radio saying, "Get back here, I got him good." So that was almost like a real social media back then, extraordinarily rare. Today you have a much more, Twitter is bringing people into the streets. They come right away. It forces all this news coverage. Back in the day, this is hard to believe unless you look at these old newspapers, the reporters were just writing what the sheriff basically told them to write and what the prosecutor told them to write. I found an interview with one of those Orlando Sentinel reporters, and he just basically says, I can't write what I want to write. I can't ask the questions I want to question because we have advertisers. And if we get the sheriff on the wrong side of us, he'll shut those newspapers down. And it happened in a case that I worked on. They ran this reporter out of town, just refused to let local businesses advertise in her newspaper. And so that's the power of social media. There's no filter now. You can't shut down Twitter unless you're China, I think.
Miss Abrams. By the way, this is the Helen Thomas of the Clinton School.
Good to see you, baby. You've grown up with gray hair. I want to do a little bit of history before I ask the present day question that I want to ask you. I remember when Thurgood would come down to see Bob Booker, and they were talking about the suit for equal salaries for people, and it was Sue Cowan Williams that was the plaintiff, and how she was ostracized for over 10 years and couldn't get a job. And then I remember when he and Bob, just one block down from where I lived, would talk about the Scottsboroughs. But more importantly, they would talk about the Elaine lynching in that case. And then I remember how today I was thinking about the people that they're not in a book. And some of us got to write the book. And those books will include some of those things. I remember how excited we were when Vic Snyder dedicated a post office to Scipio Jones, who was the lawyer down at Elaine. But I also remember how important it was, and the reason why I brought my book to get an autograph is because the woman who did the documentary on Daisy got the idea off of my table when she saw the women in that book who had been recognized, and Daisy was not being recognized at that level. And so she went on to do the documentary, and it was so hard for her because Daisy was dead. It's harder to do a documentary on a person that's deceased than one that's living like they're doing on me. I can tell my own story.
Well, that's going to be an interesting documentary.
You were in it, honey.
Will you let me edit it?
I told my children to release it after my death because
that's what I
y'all
thought.
Gonna lynch me. But the thing that I wanted to share from a history standpoint, and you know how important it is, that when we had the schools closed in 1957, Herbert Denton Jr. was one of those students that had to leave while the schools were closed. And he went on to finish and to be the city editor of the Washington Post. And when he died and came back and I planned the funeral, the Grahams all came on a plane to show their respect because he had died in Ontario as the bureau chief. But when I think in terms of being an activist today, with that oral history of all that I know across this country, and I remember when your mom was here, I remember at the funeral of Coretta, which I knew all of them on a personal basis. The lynchings, 90% of the lynchings was about a black man accused, even here on 9th and 9th and West 9th and Broadway. It's been for the longest a white man that is supposed to know of a black man having some kind of sexual relation with a white woman is a lynching benchmark. The ones that we've had here recently in all of those cities, and I've been in almost each one that we've had the riots of today, it hasn't been about a lynching about sex between the races. It's been about power, the right to be an equal citizen. But the person who still is the one that's not going to get the rights is the black man. So my question is, in all of your research, and Sharon LaCruz told me, make sure this is my Christmas present, to have you autograph it so that she'll know that I know what I've been telling her is in your book. So it's going to validate your book better than the Pulitzer Prize.
Great.
What do you think when I think of this school and all the people who have come here? I said this has been the civil rights summit for people to get the kind of knowledge that you have in this book. I've looked at everybody who's been coming, and now is a testing time. Tomorrow night, I'll be at City Hall dealing with the rise, it appears, of gangs again. You know about the HBO and banging in Little Rock.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay, that possibility. The chief of police is a black man, big, tall black man that came here to be the protector of all of us. Tomorrow, we will be dealing with the city board about if you don't get on top of the Centennial Park, which is in my neighborhood, which I was the president of the neighborhood association when we saved that park. What do you think, all of these people who are here, what is their duty once you hear the truth? That old scripture, unto those much is given, much is required. My question is, what is required of all of us here to not let Thurgood Marshall's life be in vain?
Wow.
Well, I told y'all you needed to watch her documentary. Goody? What do we need to do?
Correct me if I'm wrong, I think you were looking at Gilbert.
Yeah, I think.
You know what? I'll accept that. That's a pretty good answer. Phyllis Brown would like that answer. All right.
All right, I'll do the best I can with it. I will happily talk to you at length about this because that was a very deep question, and I'll try to give a very simple question. And I really draw the answer to this from some of the panels that I sit on, and I learn from people who, like Sherilyn Ifill, who's the head of the LDF, who's really in Thurgood Marshall's shoes today. And she's got a very busy job. She's constantly out there now, and a lot of things are happening right now. And one of her main points that she says is that, you know, we had all these great landmark changes, and from school to segregation to housing, voting rights, and yet if you look in the news today, you still see these issues are being argued. So we've had voting rights changes, segregation, that's changed. We've become more economically segregated now. Things have happened as a result of Brown, where you had all of a sudden private schools opening up and becoming neighborhood oriented. So there's a segregation that exists. Even in housing, we still see those kind of things. I think that Sherilyn's point and many of the lawyers' points today, these fights are not over. They're different fights, they're more subtle fights, and they're, in a lot of ways, they're harder fights because the moral ground isn't as obvious anymore. Sometimes they are settled in a small room with a 5-4 majority case in the Supreme Court. If you look back at the Supreme Court cases that Thurgood Marshall was involved in, this really surprised me. They were all unanimous. All of these cases were unanimous. So Brown versus Board. One of the quotes, one of the lawyers was saying that I used to sit in there and listen to Marshall, and he said, you just had this feeling that was the man who was right in this argument. And I remember there was a man named Abner Mikva, very famous judge, and he clerked for a Supreme Court justice whose name is escaping me right now. And one of the things he used to do as clerk was go in and listen to the arguments. And he told a story about Felix Frankfurter being the intellectual, professorial person on the Supreme Court. And yet, when Marshall was dealing with a 14th or 15th Amendment case, it was Marshall who was the professor. And it was, the court was leaning towards Marshall because they knew he knew this area of law better than anyone else. If you go back to Cooper versus Aaron's, which is an Arkansas case, I mean, obviously, I don't need to tell you, you probably know more about it than I do, but when that case was not settled, a year later, Thurgood Marshall was back arguing this Cooper versus Aaron's case. You can go onto a website called oye.com and listen to the arguments. And you can hear Marshall in there because usually Thurgood is very, very measured and very respectful, and he's starting to lose his patience a little bit. And you can see a little bit of that. The Supreme Court justices begin to question him, and it's almost as if they're asking Marshall how they should rule on this. And that was the power of Thurgood Marshall's understanding of these cases. And that case, unanimous, decided the very next day. And so I think that's just a tribute to Thurgood Marshall. But to get back to your question, these battles are still being fought. They're just slightly different. They've been tweaked a little bit. The language is different, but they're still the same cases, and people need to be aware of them.
I know we have a lot more questions, but we also want to allow time for you to come by and individually visit with both of these guys. And as Gilbert signs Devil in the Grove, let's give a round of applause, Gilbert King and Thurgood Marshall Jr.